John Dawson sat in his squad car, eyes scanning the quiet streets of the affluent Hartford neighborhood. His face, lined with years of hardened experience, was set in its usual stern expression. He had been patrolling this area for years, always alert for something, anything that seemed out of place. And to him, the sight of a well-dressed black woman stepping out of a luxury car was exactly that. He narrowed his eyes as she locked the car and started walking towards one of the upscale houses. Without hesitation, Dawson clicked his radio and muttered into it, "Suspicious vehicle. Black female, late 20s. Possible stolen car." As he stepped out of his cruiser, his hand instinctively moved toward his holster. The woman, oblivious to his presence at first, walked confidently, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. Her tailored navy blue suit fit perfectly, a striking contrast against the autumn foliage lining the neighborhood. "Hey, you!" Dawson's voice cut through the air, loud and commanding. The woman paused mid-step, slowly turning her head to face him. Her eyes were calm, a touch of confusion evident as she glanced at the police officer approaching her. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice measured, polite. "Whose car is that?" Dawson's eyes flicked towards the sleek black sedan parked by the curb. "It's mine," she said evenly, holding his gaze. "Yours?" he scoffed, stepping closer. "A car like that? In this neighborhood? What are you really doing here?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper. "I live here, officer." Dawson's lips curled into a sneer. He had seen this kind of attitude before, people who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. His grip on his belt tightened. "Let me see some ID." Madison, unbothered by his aggressive tone, calmly reached into her purse and handed him her driver's license. She kept her eyes on him, her posture still dignified despite the obvious disrespect. Dawson took the ID, glancing at the name, Madison Carter. It didn't ring a bell. He eyed her up and down, then looked at the car again, shaking his head. "Where'd you get this car?" he asked, his voice thick with accusation. "I bought it," she said simply, her voice betraying no emotion. "Legally." Dawson laughed, shaking his head. "Is that what you're telling me? That someone like you can afford a car like this? In this neighborhood? Don't insult my intelligence." Madison's calm exterior didn't falter. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. This is harassment, and I suggest you stop." But Dawson wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. In his world, a black woman with a car like that, in a neighborhood like this, only meant trouble. He stepped forward closer than necessary, invading her space. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back." Madison's eyes widened slightly. "Excuse me?" I said, "Turn around." His voice rose, his hand reaching for his cuffs. "You're under arrest. Suspicion of auto theft." Her breath caught in her throat, but Madison held her composure. "This is absurd. You have no reason to arrest me." "I don't need a reason," Dawson snapped, grabbing her wrist roughly. "Do as I say." There was a flicker of disbelief in Madison's eyes, but she didn't resist. Slowly, she turned around, her hands behind her back as Dawson clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists. The cold metal dug into her skin as he tightened them more than necessary. Dawson looked around, making sure a small crowd had gathered, watching the scene unfold. He enjoyed moments like this, making an example out of people who thought they were better than the law. As he led Madison towards his cruiser, she kept her head held high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her humiliated. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice steady despite the public embarrassment. "A very big mistake. Is that so?" Dawson replied, pushing her into the back seat. "We'll see about that when I run your information and see just how many priors you've got." Inside the police station, Dawson strutted like he had just solved a major crime. He ignored Madison as she sat, still handcuffed, in a chair by his desk. He filled out paperwork with exaggerated care, certain that he was about to uncover something incriminating. "Name?" he asked without looking up. Madison stared at him, a quiet intensity behind her eyes. "You already have my name." "Address?" he continued, tapping his pen against the paper, waiting for her to slip up. Madison sighed, reciting her home address. Dawson glanced at the form, scowling as he recognized the upscale neighborhood she mentioned. He couldn't believe it. "You really expect me to believe you live there?" he barked, glaring at her. "I don't care what you believe," she replied, meeting his gaze calmly. "But you will soon enough." "Keep talking," Dawson muttered, shaking his head as he finished the report. "You're going to be in a cell before the hour's up." But just as he stood to process her arrest, the phone rang at the front desk. Dawson barely paid attention at first, until he noticed the wide eyes of the officer who answered. Officer Dawson?" the officer said hesitantly. "You might want to come here." Annoyed, Dawson marched to the desk. "What now?" The officer handed him the phone. "It's the chief. Says it's urgent." Dawson frowned, taking the receiver. "Dawson here?" The voice on the other end was tight, urgent. "What the hell are you doing, Dawson? Do you have any idea who that woman is?" Dawson's heart skipped a beat, his eyes darting towards Madison, who sat calmly, still handcuffed, watching him. "She's," the chief's voice cracked. "That's Madison Carter, the new district attorney." Dawson froze, the words sinking in like a weight on his chest. The woman he had just humiliated in front of a crowd, handcuffed, and arrested without cause was the district attorney. And she had said nothing, just watched him dig his own grave. "John," the chief hissed through the phone, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The silence in the station was suffocating. John Dawson stood frozen, still holding the phone, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of his mistake became crushingly clear. He had just arrested the newly appointed district attorney, Madison Carter. He had cuffed her in front of witnesses, humiliated her, and now she was sitting calmly, watching him crumble from across the room. For a brief moment, he thought about denying it, pretending it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he could spin the story, say she was being uncooperative, or that he had reason to suspect her. But deep down, Dawson knew there was no escape. He was trapped by his own actions. Hanging up the phone, he turned slowly to face Madison. Her eyes met his unwavering. There was no rage, no smugness, just a calm, calculated gaze that unnerved him more than any outburst ever could. "Ms. Carter," Dawson's voice was hoarse, a lump forming in his throat. There's been a mistake." Madison didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her silence making the moment stretch painfully long. Finally, she spoke, her tone steady, measured. "I try to tell you, Officer Dawson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been through this before. "But you weren't interested in listening." Dawson swallowed hard. The arrogance and bravado he had worn like a shield just minutes ago were gone, replaced by a sickening sense of dread. He took a few cautious steps toward her, fumbling for the keys to her handcuffs. "I didn't know who you were," he stammered. "If I had known, I never would have." "Wouldn't have what?" Madison interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse. "Wouldn't have humiliated me? Or wouldn't have assumed that a black woman driving a nice car must be a criminal?" Her words stung. Dawson fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he finally unlocked the cuffs. Madison rubbed her wrists, standing up slowly. Even in this small, tense moment, she commanded respect, something Dawson had ignored from the start. "Ms. Carter, Dawson started again, desperate to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. Nothing he could say would erase what had just happened. "I'm sorry." Madison tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to let him know that his apology wasn't enough. She glanced around the station, noticing how the other officers were now watching with wide eyes, some whispering, others standing frozen. The humiliation wasn't just his, it was the entire department's now. "This isn't just about you, Officer Dawson," she said, her voice firm. "This is about a system that allows someone like you to act on their biases without consequence. A system that teaches officers to see people like me as threats before they even know who we are." Dawson's mouth went dry. He knew she was right, but admitting it, facing that truth, was something he wasn't prepared for. Madison stepped closer, her calm exterior making Dawson feel small and exposed. "I'm going to walk out of here," she said, her voice low but firm. "And we both know what happens next. You'll be disciplined, maybe even suspended. But that's not where this ends." Dawson's stomach churned. He hadn't thought that far ahead. The phone call from the chief had been bad enough, but what came next? What would she do with the power she now held over him? Madison gave him a look that was neither angry nor vengeful. It was simply matter of fact. You're going to be an example, Officer Dawson, and not just for me, but for everyone else who's ever been treated the way you treated me today. She turned to leave, but then paused at the doorway, as if a thought had just crossed her mind. She looked back over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Do you remember me, Officer Dawson? Dawson blinked, confused. Remember you? She nodded slowly, as if waiting for him to catch up. This isn't the first time we've crossed paths. Dawson's mind raced. He stared at her, trying to place her face, to remember if they had ever interacted before today. But his memory failed him. He could see the faintest glimmer of recognition in her eyes, like she was waiting for him to connect the dots. You don't remember, do you? Madison asked almost to herself. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated before, someone who knew she held all the power now. Dawson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was a blur. Had they met before? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. You'll figure it out eventually, Madison said, her voice cold but measured. And when you do, maybe then you'll start to understand just how deep this goes. With that, she walked out, leaving Dawson standing in the middle of the station, feeling more exposed than ever before. The room seemed to close in around him as he watched her leave, the weight of her words sinking in. The whispers around him grew louder, and he could feel the eyes of his colleagues boring into him, their judgments palpable. Dawson's chest tightened with dread. He wanted to chase after her, to ask what she meant, to demand answers. But he couldn't move. The gravity of his actions, of what he had done and the repercussions it would bring, had pinned him to the spot. For the first time in his career, Dawson felt completely powerless. Dawson couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled deep in his chest after Madison's departure. He tried to focus on his routine tasks, but his mind kept circling back to her parting words. This isn't the first time we've crossed paths. How is that possible? He racked his brain, but nothing came to mind. By the time his shift ended, the tension in the station was unbearable. His colleagues were distant, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering among themselves. The news of his blunder had spread like wildfire, and now the entire department was on edge. He could feel the scrutiny, the judgment, as if everyone was waiting to see how this would unfold. As he drove home, the city lights blurred outside the window, his thoughts consumed by what awaited him the next day. He could still hear the chief's voice in his head, cold and furious. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. He couldn't argue with that. The chief had made it clear that there would be consequences, but Dawson knew the real punishment wouldn't come from his boss. It would come from Madison Carter. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he thought about her. The way she'd calmly dismantled him, stripping away his authority without raising her voice. She had made him feel like nothing, like a rookie who didn't know the first thing about respect or justice. And then there was that nagging feeling that she knew him, knew something he didn't. It was eating him alive. The next morning, Dawson was called into the chief's office. The air in the room was thick with tension. The chief, a burly man with graying hair, sat behind his desk, his eyes burning with barely controlled anger. "Sit down," the chief ordered. Dawson obeyed, sitting stiffly in the chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. "You really screwed up, Dawson. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you brought down on us?" Dawson opened his mouth to speak, but the chief cut him off with a sharp gesture. Don't even try to explain it. I don't care if you thought she was a criminal. You arrested the new district attorney in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. Do you understand the optics of that? We're already under fire for racial profiling, and now this." The chief's face reddened as he spoke, slamming a fist down on the desk. Dawson swallowed hard. "I didn't know who she was." "That's your excuse? You didn't know?" The chief leaned forward, glaring at him. "It's your job to know, Dawson. Your job to handle situations with a level head. And now we're facing a PR nightmare." Dawson sat there, feeling every word hit like a hammer to his gut. There was nothing he could say to make it better. He had made a mistake, a huge one. The chief sighed heavily. rubbing a hand over his face. Madison Carter is no ordinary DA. She's smart, she's relentless, and she's got the entire city behind her. She's already started pushing for an internal investigation. She's not just going after you. She's going after the entire department. Dawson's stomach dropped. An investigation? Yeah. She's calling for reforms, bias training, disciplinary action against you, and probably a lot more. You've given her exactly what she needed to expose us. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of it all pressing down on Dawson's shoulders. What do you want me to do? Dawson finally asked, his voice strained. The chief stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. There's not much you can do. You'll be suspended pending investigation. There's no way around that. You're lucky she hasn't filed formal charges against you. Yet, Dawson clenched his fists in his lap. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly defeated. His career was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop it from unraveling. When the meeting ended, Dawson walked out of the office in a daze. The station felt different now. Colleagues who once nodded at him in respect avoided his gaze. The usual camaraderie had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy distance. He was no longer John Dawson, the veteran cop who knew how to handle tough situations. He was John Dawson, the man who had just humiliated the department by racially profiling the district attorney. Days passed in a blur of isolation. Dawson spent most of his time at home, his mind spinning with regret and frustration. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't entirely his fault, that anyone in his position might have made the same mistake. But deep down, he knew better. Madison's words echoed in his mind. This isn't just about you, Officer Dawson. This is about a system that allows someone like you to act on their biases without consequence. He hated how right she was. One evening, a week after the incident, Dawson was sitting in his living room, nursing a drink, when a knock came at the door. His heart leapt in his chest, dread swirling through him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Opening the door cautiously, he froze. Standing on his doorstep was Madison Carter, impeccably dressed as always, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Dawson blurted, panic rising in his throat. Madison didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the small, cluttered room behind him, then landed on him, steady and unwavering. "We need to talk," she said calmly, though her voice carried an edge that made his stomach flip. Dawson stepped aside, letting her in, unsure of what to expect. His mind raced, trying to figure out what she wanted. Was she here to negotiate? To deliver a final blow? The tension in the air was suffocating. Madison walked in slowly, taking in the surroundings before turning to face him. "You still don't remember, do you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Dawson stared at her, confused and frustrated. "Remember what?" Madison's gaze hardened. "The last time we met. Years ago. In court." And then, like a floodgate had opened, the memory rushed back. It had been years ago, back when Madison was still a defense attorney. She had been representing a young black man accused of resisting arrest. Dawson had been the arresting officer, and he had testified against the man in court, dismissing Madison's attempts to defend her client with the same arrogance he had shown her during the recent arrest. She had lost the case, despite fighting fiercely, and Dawson had walked out of the courtroom that day without a second thought. But Madison had never forgotten. "You tried to ruin an innocent man's life," Madison said quietly, her eyes burning with the weight of the past. "And now you've come full circle." Dawson's throat tightened as the enormity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about a mistaken arrest. This was about years of unchecked power, of prejudice, of consequences finally catching up to him. Madison took a step closer, her voice like a razor's edge. "Now you're going to feel what it's like to be on the other side of that power." John Dawson sat frozen in his own living room, the air thick with the tension Madison Carter had brought with her. Her words had hit him like a punch to the gut, and now, as she stood before him, it was clear this wasn't just about his recent mistake. It was about years of unchecked power, about a system that had allowed him to operate without real accountability. And now, the tables had turned. He tried to speak, but the words were stuck in his throat. For the first time in his career, he had no authority, no power to intimidate, no way to regain control of the situation. All he could do was listen, and Madison wasn't done. "You ruined that young man's life, Officer Dawson," she said, her voice still calm, but with an edge of anger simmering just beneath the surface. "He was innocent. The charges you brought against him were based on your assumptions, your biases. You painted him as a criminal because of the color of his skin, and the jury believed you." Dawson clenched his fists, a wave of shame washing over him. He remembered the case now vaguely. A young man, no older than 20, charged with resisting arrest. Dawson had written the report, testified in court, and won the case easily. At the time, it had been just another day at work, just another face in the crowd of people he arrested. But now, looking at Madison, he realized that it had been more than that. "That case," she continued, "was the first time I stood up in court against someone like you. Someone who thought they could use their badge as a shield to hide behind their racism. And I lost." She shook her head, her eyes hard. "But I swore I'd never lose to someone like you again." Dawson's stomach twisted. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. How many times had he let his biases cloud his judgment? How many people had he wronged, simply because they didn't fit his narrow view of who deserved respect? The weight of those questions pressed down on him now, harder than ever before. "I didn't," Dawson started, his voice cracking. "I didn't realize—" "Of course you didn't," Madison interrupted sharply. "You've never had to realize. The system protects you. Men like you get to walk away from your mistakes, from your prejudices, without ever facing the consequences." "Well, not this time." Dawson's throat went dry. "What are you going to do?" Madison's gaze pierced through him. "You want me to ruin your life, don't you? You think I'm here to destroy your career, to make an example out of you?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "And trust me, Dawson, I could. I could make sure you never work as a cop again. I could have you charged with misconduct, maybe even sued for damages. But that's too easy." Dawson blinked in confusion. "Well, what do you mean?" Madison stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think this is about revenge? About me getting back at you for what you did?" "No, Officer Dawson, this is about something much bigger than you or me. This is about changing the system that created you." Dawson's chest tightened. He had expected her to lash out, to use her power as district attorney to crush him, to strip him of everything. But now, her words carried a different weight. She wasn't just here for him. She was here for the whole system. "You're going to be part of that change," Madison said, her voice calm but firm. "You're going to learn firsthand what it feels like to face the consequences of your actions. But more than that, you're going to help me dismantle the system that allows officers like you to act with impunity." Dawson frowned, confusion clouding his face. "Well, what are you talking about?" Madison crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "I'm going to make sure you're disciplined, of course. You'll be suspended, and you'll go through mandatory racial bias training. But that's not where this ends. You're going to work with me. You're going to help me expose the corruption and bias in this department. And you're going to be the one who speaks out publicly about it." Dawson's eyes widened. "What? You want me to go against the department?" "That's exactly what I want," Madison said, her tone icy. "I want you to face the truth. I want you to stand up and admit that what you did, what you've done for years, is wrong. And then I want you to help me make sure it never happens again." Dawson shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "You're asking me to betray my colleagues? My friends? I'm asking you to do the right thing," Madison shot back. "You've spent your entire career turning a blind eye to the racism and corruption in this department. You've protected officers who act just like you, officers who think that black people are criminals before they even open their mouths. It's time to end that. And you're going to help me." Dawson's heart raced. This wasn't what he had expected. He thought she would come after him, that she'd try to ruin him. But this was worse. She was asking him to betray everything he had ever known, everything he had built his career on. "I can't," Dawson muttered, shaking his head. "I can't do that." Madison stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice cold and cutting. "You don't have a choice, Officer Dawson. If you don't work with me, I will ruin you. I'll make sure you never wear that badge again. But if you cooperate, if you help me expose the truth, you might have a chance to salvage some part of your career." Dawson swallowed hard. the gravity of her words sinking in. He was trapped. There was no way out. Either he became a whistleblower, turning against his department and his fellow officers, or he lost everything. He slumped back into his chair, his hands trembling. Everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, his life, it all hung in the balance. And the worst part was, he knew she was right. He had been wrong. He had let his prejudices guide him for too long. But was he really ready to admit that? To stand up in front of the world and confess to his failures? Madison's voice broke through his thoughts, softer this time, but still firm. This isn't about just you, Dawson. This is about fixing a system that's been broken for a long time. You can either be part of the problem, or you can help me fix it. Dawson looked up at her, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like never before. He didn't know if he was strong enough to do what she was asking. But as he sat there, staring into her unwavering eyes, he realized that he didn't have a choice. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Madison nodded, a hint of satisfaction crossing her face. "Good. We'll start tomorrow." And just like that, John Dawson's life was no longer his own. The weeks that followed felt like a blur to John Dawson. Every day, he stepped into the police station, feeling the weight of a choice that had changed his life forever. Once a respected officer with decades of experience, he now walked the halls as a man on the edge, knowing that any wrong move could destroy him completely. His suspension came swiftly. The official reason was pending internal investigation, but everyone knew the real reason. Dawson had become the symbol of everything wrong with the Hartford Police Department, a relic of a time when bias and unchecked authority went unquestioned. He wasn't the first to be suspended, but his case carried a different weight now, especially after Madison Carter had begun her public campaign for reform. Madison had wasted no time. The day after their conversation in his living room, she made good on her promise to use Dawson as a tool for change. She had called for immediate racial bias training within the department, launched an independent review of misconduct cases, and, most significantly, held a press conference in which Dawson's name was prominently mentioned. "Officer John Dawson has agreed to cooperate with my office," Madison announced in front of the cameras, her face calm but determined. "He will be instrumental in exposing the biases and corruption that have plagued this department for too long. This is the first step in ensuring that justice and accountability become the norm, not the exception." Dawson watched the broadcast from home, feeling his stomach twist. The phone calls from fellow officers started coming in almost immediately after the press conference aired. Some were furious, others confused, but none were supportive. Dawson's name was now synonymous with betrayal. He had become a pariah in his own department. A few days later, Madison called him into her office. The building was sleek and modern, the air-conditioned hallways a far cry from the worn-down, stuffy police station he was used to. As Dawson walked through the DA's office, he could feel the eyes of the staff on him, watchful, curious, maybe even judgmental. He didn't belong here. Madison's office was spacious, her desk meticulously organized, with legal files stacked neatly. She sat behind the desk, flipping through a document when he arrived. She didn't look up immediately, making him stand there awkwardly for a few moments. Finally, she glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Sit down, Dawson." He did as she asked, feeling the tension in his body rise. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" Madison asked, her voice steady, but the undertone was clear. There was no room for error. Dawson nodded, swallowing hard. "I do." "You're going to testify," she continued, her eyes boring into his. "Publicly. You're going to talk about the culture of this department, how it encourages officers to act on their biases. You're going to admit your own mistakes. Your testimony will be key to pushing through the reforms we need." Dawson's stomach tightened at the thought of standing in front of the public, exposing himself like that. He wasn't sure he could handle the shame, the backlash. But there was no escaping it now. "When?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Soon," Madison replied, closing the file in front of her. "The city council hearing is next week. You'll have time to prepare. But I need you to be honest, Dawson. No half-truths, no holding back. You need to tell them everything." Dawson nodded again, his throat dry. He had agreed to this, hadn't he? But now, sitting here in front of Madison, it felt so much more real, so much heavier than he had anticipated. The day of the hearing arrived quicker than Dawson expected. He sat at the front of the city council chambers, a cold sweat forming on his back as the room filled with city officials, reporters, and citizens eager to witness what promised to be a historic event. Madison was there, of course, seated at the table next to him, her presence steadying yet intimidating. She had prepared him for this moment, guiding him through every possible question, every detail of his testimony. But no amount of preparation could ease the knot in his stomach as the council members began to speak. "Officer Dawson, thank you for agreeing to testify today," one of the council members said, her tone formal but expectant. "We understand this is difficult, but your testimony is crucial to the reforms we are considering. Please, tell us about your experience in the department and why you believe these changes are necessary." Dawson's mouth was dry as he leaned into the microphone, his heart pounding. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his confession too heavy to lift. But then he glanced at Madison, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he began to speak. "I've been with the Hartford Police Department for over 20 years, Dawson started, his voice rough but steady. "And in that time, I've seen a lot of things that shouldn't have happened. I've made mistakes, big ones. I've let my biases cloud my judgment, and I've treated people unfairly because of it. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him as he continued. "The culture in the department, it encourages that kind of behavior. There's this unspoken belief that certain people are more likely to be criminals, and officers like me, we start believing that. We start acting on it. I've arrested people because of the color of their skin, not because they were actually doing anything wrong. And I didn't even realize how deep those biases ran until recently." He paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the enormity of what he was saying. "But I'm here today to say that it has to stop. I'm here to support the reforms that the district attorney is pushing for, because I know firsthand that if we don't change, this cycle will continue. More innocent people will be hurt. More lives will be ruined." Dawson glanced at Madison, who gave him a brief nod of approval. The council members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by the raw honesty of his testimony. For the first time in a long while, Dawson felt like he was doing the right thing, like he was on the right side of this fight. The hearing lasted hours, with council members grilling him about specific cases, about the department's practices, about his personal involvement in discriminatory actions. Dawson answered every question truthfully, even when it stung to admit his faults. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Dawson could feel it. His testimony had left an impact, not just on the council, but on the city itself. He had exposed the cracks in the system, and now there was no turning back. As Dawson left the council chambers, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He had done what was necessary. He had faced the truth, even when it meant tearing down everything he had built. Outside, Madison waited for him at the steps. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something, maybe respect, in her eyes. "You did well," she said quietly. Dawson nodded, exhaling a long breath. "Is it enough?" "It's a start," she replied, her tone serious. "We got a long way to go. But today, you helped take the first step." And for the first time in a long while, John Dawson felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be part of the solution instead of the problem.